All right, so welcome to everyone. We're really excited about talking with Glenn today. And as you know, this is sponsored by the Academy of Professional Dialogue. So if you don't know about the Academy, we'll put something in the chat about that and you can learn more about it. But mostly we're just so glad you're here today. This is going to be wonderful. So let's go ahead and start. And Linda, do you want to introduce our esteemed speaker?
I do. I'm very excited about it. I first got to know Glenn, or first came in contact with him at the Dialogue Summit. That was, I guess, a couple of years ago, which brought a lot of different people together. You're pinned. Hi, Glenn. You're in the middle of my screen. Oh, now, okay, we're both in the middle of the screen. And I was just very impressed, Glenn, with what you had to say there. And you've been showing up at some of the dialogues that I know Beth Macy and I have been putting on. And I knew you were into Native American thought. And the more I read about your background, it just seems like a wonderful follow-up to certainly our last interview that we did with Bernhold, who also uses a talking circle approach kind of in combination with dialogue as you do in your hybrid approach. So Glenn has been sitting at the feet of the masters in terms of having studied with Lee Nickel, Leroy Little Bear. He was in many of the what they call the seed dialogues, which I guess came after the original dialogue between Leroy Little Bear at the Fetzer Institute, where Bohm sat with Native American elders and talked about really the language differences and whatnot. And so then Glenn, I guess that kind of changed your life and you went on to do much more in that vein, wrote your dissertation at the California Institute of Integral Studies, which is where the reading that we gave everybody, that came from his dissertation. And you've been in several documentary films, and you've worked with David Peat and his work, who was also close to David Bohm. So you've really been all over David Bohm's work in many ways and deepened it in your own way with your work with Native Americans. So I'm really glad that you were able to make our interview. So,
Linda, I think Glenn wanted to start with a small ceremony. So let's let him do that before we start questioning him and peppering with things we want to know.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I was just remembering that when the first Language of Spirit dialogue was held in 1999 through the Seed Institute, the first thing I did in convening the people was just simply to say, boom, 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 boom. So it is kind of amazing that David Bohm has Om right in his name. And I don't think that is a coincidence in the way that he vibrated with the cosmos. And I want to invite all the ancestors, David Bohm, Leon Secatero, Dan Moonhoff, Alford, Toba Sonequit Canoe, Paula Gunn Allen, David Peat, and all the ancestors of each and every one of you to join the dialogue, and because we're all vessels to knowledge beyond our personal world, and ask for the help of the ancestors to help us all come to one mind and one heart, and to move in beauty and allow things to unfold as they ought to, and allow us to follow nature and follow the unfolding. May that unfold in absolute beauty and harmony. Aho, Mitaku Yasin. Thank you so much. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you to the Academy. Thank you to each and every one of you that are here, and all your ancestors, and all the ancestors of the plants, the trees, the animals, the bees, the flowers, and everything else that contributed to this moment in time. Thank you.
That's beautiful. So I guess an opening question is what first got you on this path that led you to Bohm and your work with Native elders? What was the spark?
That would be Dan Moonhawk Alford, who I just brought up in prayer. He was my mentor to Native America. I was blessed to take a class from Moonhawk and his TA, who I think was about 25 years old at the time, was Matthew Bronson. He might have been a little old. No, I think he was 25 years old. Yes, and I was 28, and I was at the California Institute of Integral Studies, and Moonhawk taught a class called Anthropological Linguistics. And Moonhawk describes himself as standing at the lonely road, the lonely intersection of quantum physics, language, Native America, and consciousness. And that's what that class was all about. And he asked us to keep a diary. He was very confident. He said, "You keep a diary. This course is going to change your life." I've never had a professor say this course is going to change your life, and really, really did in every way. So that was the beginning. Moonhawk invited in many of his mentors, people that I got to know later quite well, like Nancy Maryboy and David Begay, who were students then at the California Institute of Integral Studies, writing their doctoral dissertation, which is a real tour de force. If anybody, I mean, they basically wrote a doctoral dissertation on the order of the universe. And of course, in academia, nobody wanted to allow them to do that, but Moonhawk was one of their advocates. And so they wrote a doctoral dissertation on really the Navajo worldview in great depth. Nanita Sa Nage Bige Hozon, or Living the Order, is the title of that dissertation. So they became friends. And then it just, from there, it was Moonhawk who, we were sitting around in the back porch of my home in New Mexico, and he was smoking a pipe like he always did, and out came the pipe dream. And he said, "Why don't we bring the dialogue circle to New Mexico?" And he was referring to the dialogue circle that, as you mentioned in the beginning, Linda, that was begun when David Bohm and when Leroy Little Bear and David Pete approached David Bohm, and started that dialogue, the meeting of the minds between Western scientists and Native elders. I should say Native scientists too, because the meaning of the word science just means to know. So there's many ways of knowing. And that was how this dialogue came about. Thank you.
Yeah, amazing. Was it the language, or probably together, the worldview, the language and the worldview, that really caught your attention at that early time?
Of Native America?
Mm-hmm.
Well, to this day, I don't know I can't speak much of Native American languages, so I can't say. I learned a lot in an abstract way, about Native American languages, although I do, and one person on the call here, Mike Three Bears, he's been with me to ceremonies with the Canyoncito Band of Navajo, and the dearest elder mentor, Leon Secatero, invited me about 20 years ago. And at those ceremonies, songs are sung. I mean, even before the sun rises, morning songs are sung to co-participate with the sun rising. Those songs, when I'm there, I can start to sing them. So it's vibrating within. So the language is real in that sense, very real. And that was certainly part of it. I felt like coming home to, when I first was introduced to Native America, I felt like I was coming home to something that was already in my soul. But I will also say something that Moonhawk said. I echo him in saying he liked to tell a story because when I met Moonhawk, he'd already had 20 years of being in close contact with Native America. And he said it reminded him of when he was a child, and he was about 10 years old, and went to his father's place of birth. I tell this story in the beginning of Original Thinking, if anyone's read that book, but better tell it out loud. Anyway, Moonhawk was going to his father's place of work. His father was a longshoresman on the Pacific coast, California, and they spent the morning on a jitney, and they were stacking up logs. And that was great fun for a 10-year-old. But then lunch break came, and they took their lunch overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Their legs were straddling over the edge and overlooking the Pacific Ocean. It was the first time that Moonhawk had ever seen the ocean. And he says to his father, "Dad, that sure is a lot of water out there." And his father says, "Yep. And that's just the top of it." and and Moonhawk would tell that story as an example of the depth of Native American wisdom that one could never, ever fully expect to understand. And I very much feel the same way. So Native American wisdom has really helped my life enormously. Part of it feels like coming home, maybe because I'm part Basque, which is European Indigenous. And I think that's why I maybe gravitated to the Navajo, because the Basque were sheep herders and the Navajo were sheep herders. But there's just so much there. You can never fully experience it. But, the best thing I would say is that think of indigenous as a verb. Where you can all be indigenizing to the earth. We can all be, increasing our interconnectivity to the earth. That's really the most important thing to me. And also in doing that, in building that relationship, what's the words that I would say now are respect, kinship, and love. I would say it just comes down to that. It's all about respecting the right of everything to exist, kinship, building a relationship with all there is, and then out of that flows love. And if we try to bring love into it right away without building respect and kinship, it doesn't quite work as well.
I just have one more question. I'll hand it over to you, Nancy. So I think you're also writing a book on that topic. Is that not right? On those three terms?
I am. Well, the book will be called Original Love. The first book I wrote was called Original Thinking, and then Original Politics. Mm-hmm. And Original Politics ends with love. But I didn't know it was going to be a trilogy when I began, and it's my wife, Tomoko, who came to me about 5 years ago and one morning announced, "Sweetheart, you're going to write a book called Original Love."
Mm-hmm. Love it.
And she never does something like that. She doesn't predict my future. But she did that time. And I mean, and honestly, I found it very daunting. What do I know about love? Love, yes, we've been married for over 30 years, but love, that's a big topic. And then I was in Taos, New Mexico, talking to a woman named Jean Ellis Ancari about possibly teaching at UNM Taos there. And she was speaking, and in the middle of her own sentence, she interrupted herself, and in true Taoseño fashion said, "I just got a download. You're going to write a book called Original Love, and it's going to be the third in a 3-part series with original in the title." So, well, I pulled out my computer and I showed her a computer folder called Original Love. It was empty at the time. it was just, I just started the computer folder, Original Love, when my wife said to do it. So, but then, I continued to write Original Politics, and oddly, I changed the name for almost 2 years to Sacred Politics. And that's the name that I got a book deal under from Select Books, New York City. And so, but the funniest thing happened. It's after the second person told me, confirm this, it really made me think I need to go back to Original Politics. But I hadn't done that until my wife came back and said, sweetheart, there's an Islamic scholar writing a book called Sacred Politics. So then I knew, oh, no. I didn't want it to be about theocracy or something. So I said, okay, this, and then I changed the title back to Original Politics. The book Original Politics flowed more beautifully. And one morning I woke up with a download of at least the outline of how to write the book Original Love. And I'll just say that it'll be really about love for Mother Earth. Love. It'll be about kinship, respect, love. Yeah, that's what it'll be about.
I think it's a book for the time we're in with respect to climate change. Yeah, so it really has captured my imagination. So Nancy, I'm sure you have questions.
Yeah, I want us to talk a little bit, Glenn, about thought and fragmentation, or thought fragmentation. And I want to just start by telling a little story, because your story of starting this class that was going to change your life reminds me of my freshman year in college, which has been a long time ago now. But it was a course in semantics. And in that course, of course, Alfred Korzeniowski was talked about, and the idea that the map is not the territory, which I just found, it was like the whole semantics course was just like opened my mind in a way that all of high school had not been able to touch. But this whole idea that Korzeniowski started with, and that you talk about in some length, that we confuse the model of reality with reality itself. So that's really, Bohm says that, and I'll just quote this also, you have in your book, and then I'll ask you to speak about it. But he says that many things we believe in, and I think, and he uses the notion of nation, are simply constructs of the mind. So there isn't any such thing as a nation. There's just this map of the territory that we create, this thing in our mind. And I love what Bohm says about that when he says thought produces results, and then thought says it didn't do it, which I think is just a lovely thing. So could you say more about thought as the indigenous people view it, and particularly as it is within the construction or not of their language? Can you talk about it from that angle?
Construction that's not of their language?
That could you talk about the nature of their language, which doesn't have the same construction we have in our language,
Sure.
which is this separation?
Sure. But first, I want to go to what was an eye-opening thing for you about Korzeniowski, the map is not the territory. Wow,
Right.
That's really been, it so happens that once in a dialogue in 2004, Leroy Little Bear began a dialogue asking about the origin of the universe. That's what the theme was then. Leon Secretero was there. Brian Swim was there. And Dave Abram was there. And David Abram was, then there was a question that he asked about the map and the territory. And he was talking about, and Dave Abram was moved to tell this amazing story, which I don't know if you ever heard, but, it's about I can't tell as well as Dave, but, it's about a king that commissions a map for the kingdom. And he commissions the map, and they get all the best cartographers in the land to work on this map. And they work on it for 3, 4 months. And they unveil the map to the king. And it's like, it's quite large. It's like, 20 feet by 20 feet or something. And they prop it up as best as they can. But the king looks at the map and says, but where are my mountains? The mountains up there, the ones I look at, and they say, well, your Highness, those aren't mountains; those are hills. And he goes, oh no, those are mountains. These are sacred mountains to me. I need them on the map. These are the ones I look at and pray to each morning. And so they did that. Now they went back and they worked on it for another 3, 4 months, and and finally they bring the map back, and and it's the size of the whole indoor palace or something. They just barely get in the door, and they lay it out, and it's got the mountains on it, but it doesn't have the. The king looks at it and he's pleased until he says, "Oh, but where's my river? My river I go to every morning, and I bless myself. The river I put drops on my eyes and my forehead, and it gives me a blessing every morning. Where is my sacred river?" And they said, Your Highness, we can't put that. That's a stream. It dries up in the winter. We can't put that river on the map. But anyway, he insists, and so they go back and there's actually a few more iterations about this, but just to make the long story a little shorter, they finally come back. They've included the river, they've included the mountains, they name them after him, they include the house he was born on. But the map, when they bring it back this time, a year and a half later, is the size of the kingdom itself. So to put the map out, they have to clear every little twig, every little stream. They have to clear everything off the kingdom and then put the map on top of it. And that's what they do. But then what happens is, over time, little parts of the map start to fray, and twigs and seedlings start to come through the map, and the people say, what's this stuff? What's this stuff? This green stuff? What's this? And so for Dave Abram, who is a really wise person, this is a great metaphor for where we are at today. So to your question, I had to share that story because that's really where we're at today. We've created this complete abstraction. And so now the real is starting to poke through and come into our awareness, and hopefully more and more people notice that. So, and when you talk about thought, it's obvious that, at least in the Western world, thought has moved increasingly toward abstraction, increasingly toward the rational mind as being the king, increasingly more left brain than right brain. So we're no longer working off a whole picture and no longer working a balanced way. And we're working, gosh, if David Bohm were alive today, I mean, I think he is alive, because to me, he's a living ancestor, but he's probably turning over in his grave with how much fragmentation has continued. It hasn't got better, despite his great efforts and the great efforts of all that are practitioners of dialogue. We've gone along a path where it's increasingly fragmented, increasingly. So for Native America, what we can say about Native America is that thought is almost like a synonym for spirit. It's a movement. It's a breath. Thought is alive. Thought is moving in the room. That's why in a Plains Indian talking circle, you make an opening to the east. And the opening is for the purpose of spirit to move through the room and move through each individual. So the fact that thought is alive and that all of nature thinks, all of nature thinks is really key. Now, David Bohm believed this also, but there's a shred, Leroy would say, there's a shred of difference.
Mhm.
And for anyone who read the doctoral dissertation, I think you have to look in a footnote to see this, but there's a shred of difference between the way Bohm may have seen the world and the way native worldview is, according to Leroy. And the native view is radically that all of nature is alive, all of nature is speaking through us. And so that's it. Yeah.
When we talk about that, Nancy, I think what I think is demarks Bohm maybe from native thought, maybe you can clarify, Glenn, is Bohm would say thought is something that comes from memory, it's past, and it's what's tacit. We don't realize that thought is more kind of a left brain function. We've already done it, we've labeled it, we've made it our map, right? Whereas in indigenous thought, the way I'm coming to understand it, and I really like your writings in the chapter 4, you describe it so well. In native thought, thought is always moving. So that they're using the term differently. In other words, in native thought, to sit in a talking circle is to participate in a moving flow. Bohm would call that thinking together. In native thought, it's participative. Because it's always going, it's always moving, it's always in flux. Bohm might call that the holoflux, right?
Yeah.
So they're using the term differently.
Yes, but before I go any further, I mean, Leroy's respect for Bohm, Tobasanequit Canoe, who was one of the original 1992 dialoguers who also joined Seed Dialogue Circle, his respect for Bohm, Dan Munok Alfred's respect for Bohm was immense. So, I mean, these are really very fine distinctions you might be drawing here. I think that the spirit of what Bohm was about was very much heartily endorsed by all the Native American participants. They were very, very grateful to him. I mean, it's Leroy who began to read Bohm's writings. And because David Pete happened to be living in Ottawa at the time, and Leroy was in Lethbridge, Alberta, Canada, they got to meet. And that's why Leroy initiated the idea of bringing a meeting of the minds, of meeting Bohm. And remember, David Bohm was ostracized by the United States, and only was able to come here on special visas and stuff. So when he was coming next to the United States, that's when they got together. I mean, it was very fortuitous. And David Pete loves to tell the story of how at that first dialogue, David Bohm, and remember, he was, that was his last year of his life, but David Bohm got up and danced. So, and, David Pete said, Bohm was not somebody who normally did that kind of thing, but he got up and danced and he was really feeling the spirit. So it was just such a beautiful exchange of deep respect thinking.
Just to that point, one of the things you quoted, Little Bear, in your writing to say that I, the person, am a conduit for the manifestation of thought, but not the generator of thought. That humans have a limited, I like this, that humans have a limited range of perception, like a radio dial. And that really brought something home to me, because we do know our perception is limited. We know dogs have different perception, and animals have different perception than we have. So the idea that our perception is limited is really it's really a helpful way for me to think about it, that we're not receiving all that is in the world because of the limits of our own making up of our minds. And it reminded me that I think one of the moving things that experiences I've had in my life was being in the redwood forest in California, and feeling the aliveness of the forest. I don't think I'd ever thought it before, felt it before, but there really was something very potent and alive in that, in the stillness of the forest, that you could feel somehow internally.
Mm. That's very beautiful. Well, I think that one if we're going to be drawing distinctions, I mean, let's just say this rather than distinction. One emphasis in Native American thinking is building alliances.
Mhm.
And one emphasis in the West has been in trying to figure out how humans can learn for themselves. So in Native America, it's very common. The reason why a pipe ceremony is so sacred, is the smoke that we take in and then breathe out in the directions, depending on the ceremony, maybe the 4 directions or 6 directions or 7 directions. That smoke goes everywhere and it gets carried up, but it gets carried up, and your prayers get carried up, and you make alliances with the eagles and the hawks and who are beings that go up into these realms that humans normally don't go unless we get an airplane or a missile. So this is what is really important. It's really important to be humble enough to realize that we do have limits. So thank you for that. I agree.
Glenn, I was really touched by your comparison between what we might call Bohm dialogue and Native American talking circles, especially with respect to the function of what you call the kickstart question. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because there's something
Oh,
there that
sure.
I think there's
Sure.
something about that that's so profound that would be of value to the people on this call. It was to me when I was.
Sure. Sure. Well, I think a lot of the people here have a great deal of experience with Bohemian dialogue. And, of course, in Bohemian dialogue, Dave Bohm was speaking about the moderator working themselves out of a job, and that, it's really taking a receding role as the consciousness of the group, and you have a microculture of 20 or 40 people emerges. And as long as you're meeting on a regular basis, I think that's very true. I see that in the dialogues that you and Beth, Linda, that you were doing, that emerged because, and some of the people on the call today, their consciousness becomes fluid, so it works really well. But for when you're meeting once a year, and the Plains Indian Talking Circle method, or at least Leroy Little Bear, the way that he did it, asking a kickstart question, was profoundly important. And for me, it was the key to taking us to a deeper level. And Leroy would ask a koan-like question. He asked one year, the very first year, is it possible to have an original thought? And then what would be the reality you would experience if you were not thinking in a language? and those are great koan-like questions. Ask you to think about not thinking, ask you, the original thought. And those questions have been working through my being ever since. But he asked many other questions like that too. One year during the Bush administration, he asked, do you really, truly believe in a separation of church and state? And that was a great, great question because there was an Aboriginal woman there from Australia, and she spoke about how for her, the terms church and state, they're both abstractions. She has no relationship with it at all. But the terms land and country had meaning to her, resonated within her core being, and that she had a relationship with. So people would approach it differently, but Leroy had a special gift where he would be able to find a question that was challenging to both Western people and Indigenous people alike. And because of that, the arc of the dialogue over 2.5 days. So we're dialoguing for 2.5 days. So the arc would always be that at first there would be a little bit of confusion and grappling with the kickstart question, and then you get to sleep on it. And sometimes Leroy would give a clue about what to almost dream about, or a cue, and then the next day, at some point, there would be an outpouring of emotion. But then always by the third day, we would have a healing. And if necessary, there would be a healing right within the dialogue. And this could be done in very unusual ways. I'll just tell you one goofy way that Leroy once did. There was a little bit of anger came in. I don't know. And everything is allowed in, of course. It's a sacred container. But Leroy did the goofiest thing then, and he told people to take out a piece of paper and a pen. And they did. And then he very solemnly said, "Now draw a fish." And then they would draw a fish. And then he would say, "Now draw some holes in the inside the picture of the fish." And then, "What do you have?" "Holy mackerel." It's very goofy, but and he, in the same way, he would also use puns, and I don't know, for whatever reason, I've always been around people. The people I seem to most love and resonate with most are punsters, So and I've always found that the language, your dreaming world and your waking world, that there's always puns that want to come through, and that's a good way to break up people that are too fixated on serious thought too.
Yeah.
And I've learned that a lot from native elders. I learned that from one native elder I never even met. It was Marcellus Bearhart, because I've become dear friends with people who knew him well, and he knew enough to always balance the serious with the humorous. That's why native people tend to have a good sense of humor. And I would say that's my Jewish side too. We do too. We like to joke.
So
Okay.
since a lot of us are from the dialogue world, I'm curious, could you give any other example where you would perhaps use more of a dialogic approach, more of a Bohm-inspired approach versus a talking circle approach? When would you use one versus the other, or would you always kind of use a hybrid? How would you distinguish?
For me, I always use a hybrid.
Okay.
And I also always begin by explaining the process, even if I've been with a group that has been doing it over and over again. And I've been blessed to facilitate dialogues for Taos Institute of Noetic Sciences and Albuquerque Institute of Noetic Sciences, especially with Taos. We would do series, or would do like once a month for 3 months or something. And it would be mostly the same core group, but often there'd be, a newcomer. But even if there wasn't a newcomer, I still, what I learned from Leroy, I mean, he's definitely my mentor in a dialogue, and I'm not trying to say I'm Leroy at all, because I could do dialogues till I'm blue in the face all day long, and I don't think I get to where he is. But when he would explain the process, it's really like he's sending out a tuning fork. An A, or something. Let me give you an A. And people just start to tune in. And that is serving a very important purpose before you even start the kickstart question. So that's, I think, the purpose in explaining the process always. And also, so you don't ever discuss the process after that. You make sure everybody's clear on the process, then you do it. And by the way, speaking of do it, when Leroy pronounced conduit, he never pronounced it conduit. He always pronounces it conduit. He wants you to do it.
Nice.
I love the example of the tuning fork.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. And thinking about an orchestra coming into coherence around the sound of the A. I want to go back and ask you, maybe this will be the last question we have, because we're getting close to the time when people will go into groups. But this whole idea that's really important when we teach or try to use Bohmian dialogue around suspension, that we suspend. And the way I think it's usually talked about is that you suspend your judgment. You try not to persuade or to influence. Sometimes people say you take whatever the concern that's in your mind and you hang it up on a little line outside and just watch it, kind of thing. But when you write about it, and especially when you're quoting Lee Nichol, you write about it in quite a different way. And I just want to quote this little line that's in your paper. He says, the idea of suspend is to allow the assumption to flower within your entire organism. Instead of trying to alter it, let yourself feel its meaning, how it changes the organism emotionally, psychologically, neurophysiologically. So that seems to me quite different. And so that, the way Lee Nichol talks about suspending and the way I usually tell people to suspend if I'm trying to help them with a dialogue. Can you speak a little more about Lee Nichol's, this idea of letting it flower? Because that seems so foreign to me in a sense.
Absolutely. You were quoting Lee Nichol there. That's his writing,
right.
He might have said it to me and I took a dictation. No, Lee, he really focused a lot and brought in to the dialogue circle a Bohemian emphasis on proprioception. And, I think for Native people, they don't really, I never hear Leroy talk about proprioception. And I think it's because for Native people, it's second nature. They're already very much in their body. They're very much in their body. And so like Amist's first writer, Blackfoot, would speak about when she imagines riding a horse, it's not about the visual, it's about the feelings. It's about moving along, and it's the bouncing. It's all very kinesthetic. This, for most Native people that I've met with, that's very true. It's just more imbalance. So I think what David Bohm was doing in emphasizing proprioception and Lee Nichol in bringing into the dialogue circle is very helpful for non-Native people to get more in touch with their body and see how within them a thought is living and a thought can flower. If I were using my own words, I like to think about thinking as really from the ground up, the earth bubbling through your feet and vibrating, and then there's feeling that comes from the earth into your gut. And then it moves from your gut into your heart. And then from your heart, maybe then it goes to your brain. And that's when you'll have good rational thought. But if you jump too quick to your brain, you're missing the interconnection.
Yeah.
So I think that's really a good way of putting it. Flowering is a good way of putting it that Lee Nichol said. It does flower, it does evolve.
Goes back to that notion of holoflux, Bohm's holoflux, that the world is in constant change and is in kind of a holo movement that I think Indigenous people get from birth. That's just their way of life. Whereas
Now, let's not make too broad a brush about Indigenous people because, everybody's on a different place on the spectrum. So many people are rediscovering their Indigenous roots that have been cut off from them, your statement is absolutely true if they were raised in a traditional way.
Yeah.
But a lot of Native people are coming back to their traditional way, which is a good thing. Yeah.
What I want to do now is put people in groups of 4
I'm going to read a question from Martin. He says, could Glenn give an example of the language construction where there was no I? Bohm and Leroy were considering a new language in this regard. Is this true? Thanks. So something about in Native American language, is there, in the way they construct language, I guess, is it true that there is no I?
And so let's ask Martin if he'll come on and say that, if he'll unmute himself and speak
I
that.
don't see Martin. Is Martin here? I looked for him and I don't see him.
He may be gone. He
think
comes
he's
in
gone.
from, yeah, he comes in from China.
I
So
think-
he may not have, it's usually 1 o'clock in the morning when he comes in, so
I
he may
think
not
he's
be able.
gone, Nancy, which is why.
Yeah,
I
okay.
asked that
So
question.
anyway, you can go ahead and speak to that, Glenn, if you will.
Sure. Well, that's a big question. Very big question. It was David Bohm, not Bohm and Leroy together, who David Bohm's idea was to create the Rio mode, RHEOMOD, from the Greek to flow, Rio to flow. But that was something that Leroy Little Bear took a keen interest in, and was delighted that David Bohm had done so. And that was the fact of quantum physics inside the quantum realm. There's no really any things there. That's what Alfred North Whitehead said. There's only flux, process, and relationship. The fact of that, how similar a quantum worldview could be, and also the fact that Bohm was looking for a new way to get at that, because since everything was moving, Bohm was aware that the English language was inadequate to discuss that. So that's something that Bohm came up with, something Leroy heartily endorsed. Now, I want to encourage you all to try to contact Revision Journal. This may be hard to find. Here's a Revision Journal from winter of 2004. In here, there is the most mind-blowing essay you will ever find from Leroy Little Bear, and also he had a co-author on it, Henry Ryan Heavyhead, who's a Blackfoot linguist. And this is called The Conceptual Anatomy of the Blackfoot World. But the very first thing he says is the title is deceptive. Because really, when you get right down to it, in Leroy's worldview, there was no I in Blackfoot at all. And not even verbs. Many people are referring to the idea that in native languages are more verb oriented. Well, yes and no, but it's actually way beyond that. This is where we're talking about going into a deeper and deeper level. So really what Blackfoot is about, in my limited understanding of it, is being in resonance with the flux of the universe as it's unfolding and dissipating and disappearing and reappearing and all of that. Those sounds, those vibrations, kind of hanging with those. And that's how the languaging is formed. The languaging, what Leroy calls is, I can't even remember the exact word, but it's autakositi, it's formed, it's kind of like improvisation, it's improvisationally created. You can't speak Blackfoot without being in tune with what is unfolding, what's happening. Right. And it's not really just about verbs. It's about flux. It's really, and Lee Nickel and Leroy used to have these conversations that sometimes I was a part of. They had the conversations long before I was around, and probably long after I was around. But, Lee would take the position that, it's been 500 years since contact. So that the idea of Blackfoot being a language that could be completely devoid of I-ness may not be true anymore, and I'm not sure that Leroy would disagree with that, because Leroy is a very keen observer of Western ways, and noted that, it didn't really serve the Blackfoot well when they were ignoring the West, and thinking they'll go away. They're just a small incursion. That didn't work out too well. So yeah, I don't know if that helps answer the question or address it, but it's so far beyond what you can imagine. So
Yeah.
I could make a Xerox copy of this and send it to everyone that's on the call of this article. I know I work with Revision Journal, but I asked Jürgen Kremer, their editor, if there was an online, and he said edition of this, and he said there was through a particular library database, but I couldn't find it.
I just posted a link to it in the chat.
Oh,
You've
Wow.
already found it?
The magic of the
Who
Google.
said that?
The magic of the
Jerry.
Googles. It's Jerry.
oh my
Yeah,
goodness.
Jerry,
I saw it.
you are a wizard. You're talking
I-
about a conceptual anatomy of the Blackfoot world you just found in the chat?
Wow.
Pretty much.
Yeah,
Or
he
you
put it in there.
posted
I
it
can
to
get.
Yeah,
Well,
but
I-
you can't get the
you're-
actual article. Though. You have to go through a library.
Oh, but you gave us, what you did was you gave us the Gale Academic Online file so we can look it up. That's what.
Right. You could get it through
Okay.
Interlibrary Loan or something.
Cool.
Yeah, that's why I couldn't get. I wasn't able to find it the way. But thank you. If you
So
gave,
weirdly, I'm apparently reading the article in there, and I don't have access to those libraries. So that's kind of strange.
So you
Ah.
just typed it in and you came up with it.
All right.
Okay,
That-
thank you so much.
Yeah. Yes, let's go if we can to Mino
Great.
and have her ask her a question.
Nancy, and it was great to be with Glenn in the breakout group. And Glenn, I asked you this question earlier. Given Indigenous thought existed throughout the globe, the Earth, there's African Indigenous thought and Indian Indigenous thought and Arab and Europeans too, whatever thought was pre-modernism. Are you in touch with any movements? Are you aware of any movements that are tapping into that rich heritage in the different parts of the globe, similar to what you're doing, the great favor you're doing us?
So your question is, am I aware of a global organization or an organization that tries to unite all indigenous traditions?
No,
Or-
like people who might be doing it in Australia for Aboriginal thought and
Oh,
bringing
yeah.
it to enrich, and people
Oh, there's a
in
lot of people. all
Africa.
over.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Yeah. In Australia, Paul Callahan and is one. I know a few others too, but Paul just came out with a book, but only published in Australia. He has another one. He's a really, really dear soul because he. Remember what I said earlier about indigenous people are all on a big continuum. So Paul was. His father was not indigenous, but his mother was, and he was raised more in a Western way, and then he rediscovered and reconnected with his Aboriginal roots. This is so common, and so he's a good one. I think I would rather just put in writing something to answer your question, give a little more thought to it about who to, rather than
Thank
trying
you.
to speak off the cuff.
So Marie, would you like to ask your question? Maria? I think she's still here. Yeah.
In our group, we talked about one particular problem with the when language means something, for instance, to the people with a leftist orientation. You use dialogue, you use openness, and the interpretation is automatic in another group. The words have another definition that shows the mistrust of the language of one side towards the language of the other. And we were thinking also that we think our words resonate if we, in Canada, we are now very much aware of the hurt that was inflicted to Native people in boarding schools and so on. And when you use language and you use your nicest words, and they are met in a field of distrust of those very words, where do you start? And
so you're speaking about where do you start when you're encountering Indigenous people?
but
Or-
sometimes we use a language and we think it will open the heart of everybody. We have our preferred words to create a dialogue spirit and so on. But sometimes the words we use have either no resonance, or they have the contrary resonance in the people that we try to reach. And right now we have a lot of work to do in Canada to reconcile with Indigenous people. But we have also many, many years of using nice words and inflicting more pain. So where do we start?
Okay, yeah. Well, I mean, not to state the obvious, but the first way we start is to listen.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it's not about the words we use as much as the words that the person we're trying to understand uses, and we're listening to them. There's no doubt that, however, I think what you're speaking about is probably something like, there's a lot of Western people that have wanted to apologize to Native people. Now, I'll tell you a story about that. In 2012, the Seed Institute did a conference called Wisdom from the Origins, Mayan and Other Prophecies on the Future of Humanity. And there, in concert with the Shift Institute and James O'Dea, a dear friend and mentor, who used to be the president of the Institute of Noetic Sciences, we commissioned a document that we called the Declaration of Commitment to Indigenous Peoples that included 4 aspects. The first one was apology, but then it was, like truth and reconciliation, and then collaboration, and and so I think I'm leaving one out, but it's very important that we go beyond apology, and also for a lot of reasons. One of the reasons is that the Western worldview of time and linear time is such that that modern people don't tend to take much responsibility for what their ancestors did. But that is not the way Indigenous people think about things exactly. So it's very important to take responsibility for what has happened, because it's still here. That's why I'm always writing and always speaking about time, because, as William Faulkner said, the past is never dead. In fact, it isn't even past. It isn't past. The vibrations are here. There's no such thing as the past, really. So if whatever broken treaties occurred on a land, whatever misunderstandings occurred on the land, whatever atrocities occurred on the land, that land has to be healed, because the land is holding that. And when the land isn't healed, certain things happen. For instance, my cousin, Pam Aparicio, was a teacher at Columbine, and she was a direct witness. She survived, but to the first mass school shooting in America. Well, in Littleton, Colorado. Well, the location of where that mass shooting occurred was where during the Civil War era, the Cheyenne and Arapaho were massacred, what's known as the Sand Creek Massacre. They were massacred and relocated up from Colorado area up to Wyoming. And then there were white settlers that came in their place and form that community. I don't think that was ever healed. I don't think the prayers were said on the land. I don't think ceremony was ever done. And I think that's what tends to happen. That's when you have that eruption, which became sadly the archetype of future school shootings. So we have to heal the land. We have to understand that nothing has gone away. And obviously more and more, I don't even like the term non-native because that kind of puts people in a non-category. But people who don't call themselves indigenous, who are hopefully indigenizing and discovering their own roots, whatever they may be, and discovering their own roots where they live, they have to make a relationship with the land. That's all I want to say.
Thank you, Glenn. Lloyd, you've written something. I always appreciate when you offer your thinking and your questions. Would you unmute and say a few words?
Yes, I was fortunate to be with Glenn in the breakout too, and I've much appreciated his writings. I love original thinking. And something that I've just thought of in the last couple of days that occurred to me is a key difference that seems to me to exist between Native and Western perceptions of reality is that Native peoples are comfortable with allowing mystery to be, whereas we have what I think of as the Western conceit that given enough information, we can understand anything. And it occurred to me this morning, is this a manifestation of the difference between seeing reality as being in constant flux and reality being comprised of fixed, finite things?
Beautiful statement. I wholeheartedly concur, and I agree with your conclusion. I'll just say this briefly. If you look at the book Native Science, a wonderful book by Gregory Cajete, who's right here in Albuquerque, New Mexico, longtime director of Native Studies at UNM, University of New Mexico. Leroy Little Bear writes the foreword to that book. And one of the points that he makes in there is that in a Native worldview, it's not about laws of nature. It's about close observation of the patterns of nature. Close observation of the patterns of nature. There's not an assumption that it's always going to continue that way, but it's close observation and participation. And so it's the habits of nature. That's what I would call it, the habitual patterns of nature, which humans are a part of. And we observe that, observe the flux, and then have the humility to realize you can't know it all. And thank you for that, Lloyd. That's beautiful.
So I'd like to call on Preston. You offer an interesting question related to climate crisis and youth. If you could ask your question, unmute, please.
Yep. So yeah, I was just thinking about the climate crisis and really the social justice crisis as well that we've been experiencing in this country, United States. And my question is just, what is the duty of the youth during this time? And I feel like it's to spread this Black, Indigenous, person of color led healing, restoration, and restructuring. But I just want to know what Glenn thinks.
Healing, restoration, and
restructuring.
Restructuring. Yeah. Well, I'm all for what you're for. Restoration is a great word. I think of it as restoring. So we say restoring, but it's a story, and so it's one of the most beautiful things you can do. I mean, my thing about climate change, my approach to climate change is this: we are the climate, we are the earth, we are the air, we are the water, we are the soil. All the ancients understood that. Indigenous peoples understand it readily today, but all the ancients, you could read Leonardo da Vinci writing about this, and that the human is the microcosm of the macrocosm. There's the the tides move in and out, like our lungs move in and out. We have bones within our body, like the rocks within the earth. We are the microcosm, the macrocosm. The earth has covered by 70% oceans, and we are approximately 70% water within our bodies. So it's very much my. I'll say a few things that could be considered controversial. I think we're on the wrong path with Western science when we're having a conversation about how humans are affecting the environment. All we're doing there is reinforcing that polarity, reinforcing that distance between us and so-called nature out there somewhere. It's not like that. I mean, we're mammals that are actively participating. When we breathe out carbon dioxide, we're feeding the plants and allowing them to do the process of photosynthesis. We are part of the climate, so you can't, of course we're changing and affecting it. We're all changing, affecting everything. So my heart of hearts, the only way we're going to grapple with the changing climate is, first of all, becoming more comfortable with flux, and then building a heartfelt relationship with the elements. It's not a coincidence that indigenous peoples like the Pribumi in Indonesia knew that the tsunami was coming without any instruments of any kind. They knew it was coming. All the Western people who were depending on technology to warn them of something, well, not all of them, but many of them died because they didn't move. The Pribumi moved to higher ground because they had a relationship literally with the waves. They were developing a relationship with the waves. To the extent that's possible, we could all at least, and there's so many intermediaries, our animals, most of us have pets. They're great teachers for us. My dog here, Momo, has been here the whole time, and he's a good teacher for me, a teacher of love and a teacher of kindness. But also the animals will notice the vibrations. The little ones, the ant nations, are going to notice the vibrations and watch them, observe with them, and then you'll know when something's changing. All of that is critical, but most of all, love for Mother Earth, which I think I said before because I can't say it enough. The only way we're going to change our attitude toward climate change is love. We're not going to be shocked or scared in a changing because people aren't wired that way. They're we process stress through our amygdala. Everybody, so we can only hold stress like that for so long. We can only be scared for so long. Then we tune it out, which is what people are doing. They're all tuning it out. And like the movie Don't Look Up, it makes some good points about that, and it reinforces, it shows how people are tuning it out. But what that movie is missing is that it comes out a very little bit in the end of the movie, but it's really through heartfelt connection and love for the land, that's how people are going to change. And so those are the seeds I want to. All right, thank you.
Thank you. We probably have only time for one more, and I want to call on Renee, who has a question. And I'm aware, Renee, because Renee and I are really good friends, talk regularly. And I'm aware that Renee's father just died this past week. And she and I have talked a lot about that. But Renee, would you ask your question?
Yes, well, Glenn will know my curiosity about this. So I'd just like to hear you speak about how Indigenous people speak about death and dying, and also what's their language for this transformation?
Thank you. What a beautiful question. I'm going to turn my computer around because I'm going to show you what's behind me. Let's see, or actually just, yeah, I mean, can you see there? Those are all ancestors. Hold on a second.
we were able to
Those-
see those many.
Those are all ancestors. I'm probably what you would call an ancestor worshiper. I have a belief in what I would call, I mean, I just did a podcast with Regina Waterspirit, who is the wife. She doesn't like to use the word widow, but the wife of Marcellus Bearhart, and Tim Amston, who was the editor of a new book called The Bear's My Father. And, we were speaking about that in this podcast. I mean, so I'm speaking for myself here, but a lot of what I'm speaking about, I think, will be Indigenous people will agree with, but I'm not necessarily trying to represent that here. Okay, so the ancestors are alive. I was blessed to be in your group, Renee, and you were talking about how your father died, but your mother had dementia and she didn't seem to know he died. Well, maybe it's your mother is actually continuing to talk with your father very openly. Maybe. I'm not trying to tell you what's happening here, but one of the things, the positive aspects of dementia that people never consider is sometimes it opens people's heart more, because the culture as a whole is too in the mind. So it's a way of preparation for death, is getting the rational mind out of the way and coming more into your heart. So in short, I often go to the sacred grounds of the Canyon Sindo Band of Navajo, which is near Mount Taylor. It takes about 5 hours to get there over dirt roads. And when they go there is October 1st through 4th. And they go there to commune with the ancestors. That's their new year. The new year could be called any time of year. The year is a circle. So, and that's a beautiful thing, because it's understood that the ancestors are speaking through us all the time. So that's it. But I will say one more thing, Renee, which will be a challenge for you. A lot of my Indigenous friends have said that in the first year after you lose like a parent and also some dear loved one, that first year you may be partly in the spirit world with them for the entirety of that whole first year. So this will be a challenging time for you, also a very creative time for you. And you will get to a deeper place of wisdom, but it will be challenging. But
Wow.
so many people have gone through it. You'll make it through too. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
That was a beautiful ending. Thank you so much, Glenn. That was restoring to me as well. So I thank you. I want to make a right turn here and let you hear from and meet the person who's going to be our next interview person next month. And we already have the date. I think it is March 25th. I haven't got the flyer yet, but I'll be sending it out. And so I'm going to spotlight you for a minute, Taskia, and if I remember how to do that, there we go, there, and ask you if you'll talk a little bit about the work that you've been doing with dialogue and as it relates to COVID.
Thank you. Well, that is a right turn. I was very much into your story and all the thought and feelings it evoked, Glenn. Thank you very much, and everyone, for the conversation. Well, but let's do this the way I drive. I always make those hard turns. My name is Saskia. I'm based in the Netherlands, as is Nelleke, who's also on this call. And I work as a consultant and facilitator of dialogue. And last year we have been invited by the Dutch government to help them in a couple of dialogues with parts of the Dutch society in order to, well, help them find their way through the pandemic. So it started with a lessons learned a series of dialogues after the first wave, where the government wanted to learn about the first wave and see how they could respond differently or the same to the second one. And later on, we had dialogues with all kinds of people throughout the country on how they experienced the pandemic, what it ruined, but also what came to, what good came out of it, maybe in unexpected ways. So in order to think of a restoration agenda after the first phase, and those were beautiful and very much connecting, I don't know if that's a word, bridging dialogues. And just last Christmas, we held dialogues with people on how to learn with the virus. So what ideas are there in society on how we can learn to live with the virus, because the government wants to change their, change the basic idea of the policy from a crisis management, the idea that you can, that it's a crisis that needs to be managed and that you can beat the virus, all this warlike talk that we have in our country. I don't know if it's the same in other countries, to a more, well, after today, I would say, more accepting that it's a flux, that the virus will stay with us and it will need us all in creative dialogue and also in a constructive way of thinking. And after today, I would say also with love on how we can work together to minimize the damage and to make the best of it. And so we had dialogues with people on that. And I found it very special that the government really took this also. I felt that they took it very seriously and really tried to reach out how to get people into a conversation. And it was not so easy because when people, the first time people would think, what is this kind of strange information meeting? Because they're not used to being in a dialogue with a government. And I think that's also not even possible because it's only people who can be in dialogue. So both with the civil servants and with the people participating, we had to look for ways how to get into a real conversation. And I would be honored to share some of our experiences in that regard.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Saskia. And I know Martijn is going to be with you as well.
Yes, so my colleague Martijn is also going to be here, but it's Friday night here and it's 10 to 8 and he has 3 little kids, so reading them bedtime stories. But he will be joining us 25th of March, and we will talk about how we use story, because it's a different kind of language than the formal language, how we used stories and even kept stories of people integrated in the policy memos. There were still quotes of citizens and people who participated, and I think that made a difference.
So Saskia has shared a lot of that with me as we went along through that. So I'm really looking forward to next month and having you do that. I'll remove you from Spotlight now.
Thank you.
And let's see, I tried to remove you from Spotlight. I don't think I actually did. Maybe I'll try again here in a minute.
And then we can all put ourselves back on gallery and then.
Yeah, that would be good. Yeah. So just to say that when we end, very often we've invited you to ask a question, but sometimes when we end, people would just like to say a word or two to Glenn or to someone else. And so in this last few minutes before we reach the top of the hour, if anyone wants to say anything, please just unmute and say whatever you'd like to say for a few minutes. And then as you leave, we're so pleased you were here and look forward to seeing you next time.
There were a couple more questions. So if you want to raise your hand, either to make a comment or to actually ask your question. I know Tom O'Connor had a question, and there was an interesting one from, get there eventually.
And I would just remind you again that anyone that wants to talk about this issue of privacy, which is on my mind, I'd be pleased if you'd stay around after the meeting ends.
Yeah, there's some interesting things in the chat. Yeah, Daniel, you had an interesting question if you feel like asking that.
I almost feel like it's a little bit late. Yeah, I was just, it sort of follows up on a couple other questions, and that is, I don't see my question here, but I think I remember it, is how would you, trying to come from a Native American perspective, stressing wholeness and how the whole world fits together, how would you deal with kind of people I deal with sometimes, who are bureaucratic expert types who are so in the habit of breaking the world down into variables and talk about everything as evidence-based, and they mean evidence-based columns of statistics. And I was just wondering if you are in a dialogue with such people as that, how do you make the bridge to their way of thinking?
That's a tough question. My goodness,
That's
Daniel.
why I'm sorry to ask it at the end.
Oh, it's a good
Try
one.
to give a very, very brief answer. Story tells stories. Stories will reach people on levels they may not even realize till later.
It's a lovely answer. Yeah.
And I can't help but ask Tom if you'd be willing to very quickly ask your question, just because it's so relevant.
Well, I was hoping to hear from other people, but quickly was, Glenn, I noticed that most of the ancestors and the people who've influenced you that you mention are men. And I find the same in myself, in my own tradition. And it's disturbing to my wife and my daughter, and I realized I live in that space. So where do we need to evolve? Because there's clearly something amiss about it.
There's some very important women ancestors to me too. Wallagan Allen. Actually, Madame Blavatsky I pray to daily, very misunderstood mystic. So but yeah, no, there may be a preponderance of men. I don't keep track of that exactly. In fact, Leon Secatero, when we used to do the dialogue circle, he had such a developed feminine side that I always try to get a balance of masculine and feminine energy, but I counted him as two people, one man, one woman, because he was in perfect balance. That's
Thank
it.
I would think, Tom, I think your question is exactly the question we need to keep asking. But I think most of us hold in our hearts the women in our lives, our mothers. So they may not be in the literature, but I think they've had huge influences on our lives.
Well, and I think what you say, Glenn, in your book, Original Politics, about certainly the Iroquois, how women, I mean, they gave us the Iroquois nation, I think you said, our ability to impeach our president, because at least in their culture, it was the women. If the leader, who was probably male, wasn't doing a good job in protecting family and children, then the women would be able to vote them out, right?
Right. The Iroquois women, the clan mothers, nominated and had the right to remove the male chief. Chief was always male, but they could remove him. They also were involved in 2/3. 2/3 of the women had to approve a treaty or to go to war. So no, the women were very directly involved. And I did say that it had something to do with impeachment. The founding fathers generally credit impeachment to the British tradition. They do so in the Federalist Papers, but in Britain, you couldn't impeach the king. So at least in theory, in the United States, in theory, you could impeach or remove the president, but it's never happened yet.
We tried 2 times.
I don't think we want to go there right now.
No, but any other comments or closing thoughts, reflections?
Hello, everyone. My name is Halima. Can you hear me, Glenn?
Yeah. Hi, Halima.
Hi. I was very intrigued with the conversation we had about Bohm's theory about coherence and incoherence in our group. And I would love to hear you say a little bit about that as we conclude this beautiful session. And thank you again, Glenn. See you soon, I hope.
Thank you. Coherence. Yeah. A laser is coherent, so I'll try to be laser focused. A coherence is a beautiful concept. You could reframe it if you wish. If you were probably a native person, might say harmony or beauty. It's all the same, beauty, harmony, balance, balancing, because balance is always dynamic. All of those things are so beautiful and so necessary to tune into. And thank you, David Bohm, for realizing the importance of that. Thank you for this group, each and every one of you, for realizing the importance of that. Thank you for being a coherent group. Thank you. It's a great blessing to be here today. I really appreciate the work that's being done by a lot of people on this call. Some of them I know real well and know the beautiful work they're doing, and some I do not, but I can tell they're doing beautiful work. So what an incredible blessing to be with you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Glenn. And with that, let us close. And again, if anyone would like to stay to talk about this issue of privacy, I'd be appreciative.